Good morning, Wabash. Our speaker today was born in Crawfordsville, Indiana. He grew up in Ladoga, only 15 miles southeast of here. He attended Wabash College, where he graduated in 1970, along with Bill Plaker and Mike Bachner. From there, our speaker then went to the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, where he received his master's and his PhD. Over the years, he has taught at the University of Iowa, Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi, and Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia. He's been at Wabash for 18 years. With a chapel talk entitled, "To Sparta and Sandy Pylos, Some Sentimental Reflections," please welcome Dr. David Blix.
I should begin by saying that I have a cold and my voice is not what it ought to be, and for that I apologize. So I ask that you bear with me. It is conceivable that I may have a coughing fit in the middle of it. If that occurs, talk amongst yourselves and I will swill the syrup. It may have been the best Christmas ever, for this all happened at Christmas, a couple of years ago at Christmas. I mean, that's when the story happened that I'm about to tell you. This talk is about my father, Fred Blix, or more precisely, Dr. Fred M. Blix, M.D. For my dad is a medical doctor who is now retired and who is in good health, and along with my mom, lives happily in Zionsville, Indiana. As often as I can, I visit them. More precisely still, this talk is about my relationship with my father and his relationship with me. Hence my title. For you will recall how the ancient Greek poet Homer starts his great epic poem, the Odyssey. Young Telemachus is the son of the hero Odysseus. 20 years ago, Odysseus went off to fight in the Trojan War and has not yet returned. But Telemachus has reached the age, and his chaotic household has reached the point where he needs to find his father. He is unhappy and wants to know who his father is. I like this part of the Odyssey. My talk this morning is my version of it, the story of one man's search for his father. I should say at once, therefore, that as stories go, this one is unabashedly personal. Indeed, at times, it is unabashedly sentimental. But it is a good story, and in the open spirit of this college, not to mention the spirit of Homer, I thought we could pass some pleasant time this morning together as I tell it to you. I said all this happened at Christmas. My family got together for Christmas a few years ago at my parents' home in Zionsville. It was a jovial gathering. My younger brother, Paul, was there. He'd driven down from Madison, Wisconsin. So were my two sisters and their families. My one sister, Marcia, directs the School of Nursing at Southeast Missouri State University. My other sister, Suzanne, is a medical doctor in Indianapolis and is connected with IUPUI and Riley Children's Hospital. Occasionally, she interviews prospective applicants to medical school, including men from Wabash. Now, before I go on, I should add that there's a goofy, unpredictable quality to my family, which often surfaces when we get together for holidays. Indeed, when I recall some of the stories about my family, I think of some of the stories that are told by the American writer and humorist James Thurber, such as The Night the Bed Fell, or The Day the Dam Broke. To illustrate, I recall an incident that took place many years ago when I was in high school. One summer, the six of us, my parents and my three siblings, took a vacation in Jasper National Park in Canada. We had an Airstream travel trailer, and we were camped out in a campground. One evening, just as the sun was setting, we decided to take a walk around a nearby lake. It had been raining all day. We'd been cooped up inside and were going stir-crazy. We thought a walk would do us good. We drove to the lake and parked. We set off on the trail which wound around the lake. It was downright spooky. On the left was the lake itself. On the right, for a while, a swamp. We finally got to the other side of the lake. There we discovered a clearing in the woods strewn with pine needles. In the middle of the clearing was a big tree, and nailed to the tree was a big sign. We crowded in to read the sign in the light of the setting sun. It said, I quote, "This is an area that is frequented by bears. The bears often come out to play at sunset. If you look up, you might see them frolicking in the branches above you." Unquote. Silence fell. We didn't see any bears, but we slowly backed away from the sign and decided it was time to get the hell out of there. We started walking back to the car, slowly and quietly in single file, with my mother leading the way and my father bringing up the rear. All of a sudden, a large acorn came tumbling out of a tree and hit my mother square on the head. Now, I should hasten to add that my mother is not an excitable woman, but when she gets wound up, there is no stopping her. She stopped dead in her tracks, with the rest of us bunching up behind her like an accordion, and she cried out in a voice that would have awakened the dead, "The coconuts are falling. The coconuts are falling." After pausing a few moments to determine just where the coconuts had come from and how many coconuts there were, and who actually had been hit by the coconuts, we realized what had happened and started laughing hysterically. Then we remembered the frolicking of the bears, and we ran all the way back to the car. That's the sort of thing that happens in my family on a fairly regular basis. It explains so much. But I am straying from my story. On Christmas morning, a few years ago, we were in our family room opening our Christmas presents. We had pretty much finished. Then my mother said, from the other side of the room, where she and my dad were sitting, "David, there should be one other small box for you behind the tree." I looked and found it. I opened it and started to laugh. It was a nice, shiny, new nameplate for my desk with my name on it, Dr. Blix. And here it is. I laughed, and for two reasons. One is that what with my dad and my sister both being doctors, we always joke about the fact that there are 3 Dr. Blixes in the family, and about which Dr. Blix is wanted when someone calls the house at Christmas or Easter and asks for Dr. Blix. I also laugh because I thought of my desk in my office. My parents had recently visited me at Wabash and had seen my desk. It's better now. My mother had been appalled, and my dad had shaken his head sadly. "We need to get you to clean up your desk," he said, and now he had cleverly found a way. This little Christmas present was to be my motivation. I needed to clear off my desk so I would have a place to put the new nameplate which they had made for me. This bit of joking between me and my father brings me to the heart of my story. I was born in Crawfordsville, as Will just mentioned, and grew up in the small town of Ladoga, which is about 15 miles southeast of here. My parents had moved there shortly after World War II. They had met in Chicago during the war while my dad was in medical school and my mother was in nurse's training. As was the custom in those days, your medical school found you a place to set up your practice, and they had sent my parents to Ladoga. I must say, and this is one of my unabashedly sentimental moments, that as far as I can recall, I had a very happy childhood growing up in Ladoga. It was, and still is, a close-knit community. I was active in the Ladoga Presbyterian Church and went to Ladoga High School, which was later absorbed into Southmont. But as the years went on, I became increasingly aware that I just did not know my father very well. As a physician in a small town, he was often busy and often away. He was not around. Not only did he tend to his patients in Ladoga, but he was forever and always driving around Montgomery County, often late at night, making house calls. Doctors did that in those days, you understand. I'd see him at dinner and sometimes at breakfast, but then he'd be off again, and I was usually in bed by the time he got home. He was also on the staff of what is now St. Clair's Hospital in Crawfordsville, but what was then Culver Hospital. He spent a lot of time at the hospital and indeed eventually became chief of staff there. During the 1950s, he is what we used to call a general practitioner. Later, in the 1960s, he was certified as a practitioner of family medicine, as it had come to be called. For a number of years, he was also the anesthesiologist at Culver. I still remember riding in the back seat of the car with large tanks of, I believe it was nitrous oxide, sitting next to me. He and my mother moved to Zionsville in 1975 when he became director of the residency program in family practice at St. Vincent's Hospital in Indianapolis. Now, I said that my father was not around and was busy and often away. I do not mean to say that he was cool or distant to me, for he was not. But I felt a distance between us nonetheless, especially as the years rolled on. I was unhappy about this. I felt somewhat empty. To be sure, there were moments when you could say we connected, but they were always a bit odd. For instance, my father's office was on the first floor of the old Victorian house we lived in Ladoga. It's still there, by the way. We lived upstairs, and sometimes when there were no patients around, he'd let me sit in his office and swivel in the chair behind his desk. It was also in his office that I one day discovered, whilst he was out of the room, his copies of the Kinsey Reports. Volume 1, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, and Volume 2, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. I read these avidly, or rather, I tried to read them because I would only have short intervals of time to cover a lot of material, and there were no pictures at all. It was all graphs. But my imagination was active even then, so it made no difference. Or again, one year in grade school, I went out for basketball. Basketball, as incredible as that may now seem. My dad took time off from his office hours one afternoon to come to a game. But inasmuch as it became apparent very quickly that I had no athletic ability whatsoever, I was glad he was there, but I was also embarrassed that he would see me as such a klutz. On still another occasion, he obtained permission for me to observe surgery at the hospital. Unfortunately, it was eye surgery. So the surgeon, not my father, administered the anesthetic. As the surgeon did so, with a long needle stuck into the eye socket of the young man they were operating on, and then began cutting the surface of the eye, I got sick to my stomach. I had to leave the operating room. But as I did, I remember that as the anesthetic was being administered and the young man was crying out in pain, my father tightly held his hand. And so it went. There was one event, however, which I still remember, or I think I remember, because I can never be sure it really happened, which was a moment of real connection between us. One holiday, we had a number of relatives visiting us. To make room for my grandmother and my aunts, I got to sleep out in the Airstream trailer, which we kept parked alongside the house. It was actually kind of a thrill to do that. I was sleeping there one morning as my dad left for work. I remember that very early that morning, when I was half asleep or half awake, the door of the trailer opened and my father came in. He came over to the bunk where I was sleeping. He bent over me and gently placed his hand on my head and stroked it. He said nothing and then left. I believe this happened, though both then and now I do not know for sure. But the memory itself is very warm. In short, I was unhappy about my relationship with my father. I felt I did not know him and often did not understand him. For years, I thought it was just me. But once I had a conversation with my brother, Paul, and he said the same thing. It was as if my father did not really exist in my life. He was away at Troy, and I not only missed him, but did not really know enough of who he was to be able to say that I missed him. I recall that when I was very young, I once overheard some men talking at the courthouse in downtown Crawfordsville. My father was the coroner that year, or perhaps he had been called in as a consultant on a case, I'm not sure. For some reason, he had brought me along, and I was waiting for him out in the hall. I overheard the men in the hall talking. "Yep, Dr. Blix is in there right now," said the one man. "Dr. Blix, who's that?" said the other. You know that sort of smallish man from Ladoga? Oh, yeah, said the other. And I was ashamed to hear my father called small. But at the same time, I felt guilty that perhaps I thought the same thing of him. I did not know enough of him to think of him as big or great. I graduated from Ladoga High School in 1966 and from Wabash College in 1970. I then went off to graduate school at the University of Chicago and first came back to Wabash to teach in 1988. My first teaching appointments at the college were temporary sabbatical replacements, but after several leaves and returns, I returned again in 1996, and here I am. Now, I mention this bit of information simply to note that beginning in 1988, I had occasion to come back and live in Crawfordsville. And as a result, my relationship with my father began to change dramatically. It's not that I saw him any more often than I had previously, but it's that I began to see him in a new light. I began to get a new perspective on him due to a new and wholly unexpected set of experiences. As I settled into the Crawfordsville community, I began to run into people, some of whom I knew and some of whom I did not know, who started telling me stories about my father. They had known him. Like Telemachus, it was as if I had gone to Sparta or Sandy Pylos. I began hearing stories about my father from people who had known him over the years. These stories revealed to me a man whom I had not known, but who, as I got to know him through these stories, turned out to be rather different from anything I'd ever expected. The first few stories I heard were from various of his former patients. One man in town, who'd once been in the hospital for surgery, said that every night before my father left the hospital, he'd come by and chat for a few minutes, even though he was not my father's patient. Another man was riding the elevator in the hospital and ran into my dad, whom he had never met. My dad introduced himself. The man's wife was in the hospital, and my dad said, "Oh, you're Mr. So-and-so. I'm Dr. Blix. I just wanted to let you know that your wife is fine." On a different note, I ran into a number of women in town, some of whom I believe had worked at the hospital and some of whom had various jobs around town. "Oh, are you Dr. Blix's boy?" they'd ask. "Yes," I'd say. "Yes," I'd say. "Well, we loved your dad. You know, he was always so funny and so gallant. So gallant. He was such a gentleman." Shortly afterwards, I had dinner with my mom and dad, and I told him this story. And my mother turned to my father and said, "Honey, who were those women?" My dad blushed a little and winked at me as if to say, "Son, there are some stories that are better left untold." I mean, nothing had gone on, but it was worth the wink. Then he and my mom looked at each other and started laughing as if this were an old comedy routine they had done before. But the best story, which I've heard from several sources, is about my dad as an actor. Somehow, my dad found time in the 1960s and 1970s to act in what was then called the Sugar Creek Players, the community theater group, now the Vanity Theater. One year, they put on a play called The Thurber Carnival. The Thurber Carnival. Now, for those of you who do not know it, this play is based on a collection of short stories and memoirs by James Thurber, the writer and humorist I mentioned earlier. It was originally published in 1945. There's one story called The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, which is included in the play. In the story, an ordinary guy named Walter Mitty is always drifting off into daydreams about himself as one kind of hero or another. In one of his daydreams, he imagines that he's a great surgeon who is about to perform a crucial operation that saves a man's life. Thurber weaves in all kinds of made-up medical jargon. For instance, there is streptothrombosis, which as far as I know means nothing. Or there is coreopsis, which is actually the genus name for a kind of flower. Anyway, here's the crucial scene, which I have to read in full to get the full effect. "It's the millionaire banker, Wellington Macmillan," said the pretty nurse. "Yes," said Walter Mitty, removing his gloves slowly. "Who has the case?" "Dr. Renshaw and Dr. Benbow, but there are two specialists here, Dr. Remington from New York and Mr. Pritchard Mitford from London. He flew over." A door opened down a long, cool corridor, and Dr. Renshaw came out. He looked distraught and haggard. "Hello, Mitty," he said. "We're having the devil's own time with Macmillan, the millionaire banker and close personal friend of President Roosevelt's. Obstreosis of the ductal tract, tertiary. Wish you'd look at him." "Glad to," said Mitty. In the operating room, there were whispered introductions. Dr. Remington, Dr. Mitty, Dr. Pritchard Mitford, Dr. Mitty, etc. "I read your book on streptothrombosis," said Pritchard Mitford, shaking hands. "A brilliant performance, sir." "Thank you," said Walter Mitty. "Didn't know you were in the States, Mitty," grumbled Remington. "Coals to Newcastle, bringing Mitford and me up here for a tertiary." "You were very kind," said Mitty. A huge, complicated machine connected to the operating table with many tubes and wires began at that moment to go bucket, 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 bucket. "The new anesthetizer is giving way," shouted an intern. "There is no one in the East who knows how to fix it." "Quiet, man," said Mitty in a low, cool voice. He sprang to the machine, which was now going pocket-a-pocket-a-quick, pocket-a-quick, pocket-a-pocket-a-quick, pocket-a-quick. He began fingering delicately a roll of glistening dials. "Give me a fountain pen," he snapped. Someone handed him a fountain pen. He pulled a faulty piston out of the machine and inserted the pen in its place. "That will hold for 10 minutes," he said. "Get on with the operation." A nurse hurried over and whispered to Renshaw, and Mitty saw the man turn pale. "Coreopsis has set in," said Renshaw nervously. "Coreopsis. I wish you would take over, Mitty." Mitty looked at him and at the craven figure of Benbow, who drank, and at the grave, uncertain faces of the two great specialists. "If you wish," he said. They slipped a white gown on him. He adjusted a mask and drew on thin gloves. This scene is reproduced almost verbatim in the play. My dad played one of the doctors. The cast also included retired Wabash speech professor emeritus Joe O'Rourke and former Wabash president Thaddeus Seymour. There was also a little orchestra that provided the music, and one of the members of the orchestra was named Charlie Winter, who played a mean saxophone and now lives over in the brick house with the brick wall on the corner of Wabash and Wilhoit, over yonder. Anyway, Joe O'Rourke, Thaddeus Seymour, Charlie Winter, my dad, and others had rehearsed for weeks. The play had opened, and the performances were going were going quite well. One day, however, Charlie Winter came into the emergency room at the hospital. He had badly hurt his hand at work. It so happened that the physician on call that evening was my father. My father came over to look at Charlie's hand. It looked bad and bloody. The nurses and some other doctors also came over and were hovering about. As my dad examined the hand, he apparently got a very serious look on his face. He looked Charlie in the eye and said solemnly, "Charlie, I don't know how to tell you this, but you've got obstruosis of the ductal tract." Tertiary. Still worse, I'm sorry to have to tell you that choreopsis has set in. Charlie blanched and picked up his cue at once. He looked at my father, his face a study in despair. "Oh, doctor," he said, "you can level with me. Will I be okay? Will I live?" My dad said, "Well, Charlie, it's hard to say. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. The choreopsis is very bad." In the meantime, of course, the hovering nurses and doctors had no idea what the hell was going on. They stopped dead in their tracks and were apparently whispering among themselves. Choreopsis? What's choreopsis? Have you ever heard of choreopsis? But then Charlie and my dad couldn't hold it in any longer. The jig was up, and they burst out laughing. And so it happened that, in a way I had not expected, I discovered a new side to my father. There were other stories. I can't tell them all here. I found him to be a wonderfully humane and compassionate man who'd constantly helped many people in many ways, usually quietly and often without being asked. He was a man possessed of an admirable sense of humor and, as it turned out, a man of such modesty that he had never drawn attention to these qualities in himself when he was around the house. I found him to be a very great man after all. Sometime after I'd heard the Walter Mitty story, some years ago now, I brought it up one night at dinner. My dad broke into a big grin. "Yes," he said, "we had a great time." My mother chimed in, "Honey, you never told me that story." And I laughed. So at Christmas a few years ago, I laughed again when I saw the nice, shiny new nameplate which my parents had made for me. It somehow seemed to bring everything full circle. It somehow seemed to reflect the new relationship I felt I had with my father. We'd finished unwrapping our gifts and were cleaning up the paper and ribbons that were strewn on the floor. I went over to my parents and thanked them for the gifts, adding that I really appreciated the nameplate. I said, "You know, now that I have this, I have a real motivation to go get my desk cleared off. I really appreciate the fact that you made it for me." My mother looked at me quizzically. "Oh, no," she said. "We didn't have that made for you. That's your father's nameplate. That's the nameplate he had sitting on his desk in his office for all those years back in Ladoga. He wanted you to have it. It's his legacy to you." I looked at my dad. "Is that true?" I asked. "Yes," he said. We hugged. I wept. And my father smiled at me. Like I said, it all happened a few years ago at Christmas. Odysseus and Telemachus had found some common ground, and I felt safe in the halls of Ithaca. It was the best Christmas ever.
Thank you, Dr. Blix. Two quick announcements. Why America Still Needs Classics is a talk April 22nd at noon in Center 216 by Dr. Koff, hosted by the Wabash Conservative Union. And secondly, the last TGIF of the semester will be tomorrow at 4:15 at Beta. Let's all rise and sing Old Wabash.